Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Welcome to the Missing Dots. For 14 centuries, we were told a single story that the Quran was preserved word for word through perfect oral transmission. No drift, no change, no human fingerprints. But when history speaks, when manuscripts whisper, and when science steps into the room, the narrative begins to crack. Tonight on The Missing Dots, we open the files. No one wants to touch the forgotten codices, the erased verses, the vanished aruf, the qur'at that don't agree, and the standardization that reshaped the book for the modern world. This isn't an attack. This is an investigation. And once you hear what lies beneath the surface, you will never see the story of preservation the same way again.
You know, it's stepping out here into the courtyard right now. It's almost startling how quiet it gets.
Yeah, it really is.
Like the prayer just finished inside. The majority of the crowds have kind of filtered out through the main gates, and we're just left with, well, the sound of the wind moving through these archways.
Right. It's just really peaceful out here, and I'm genuinely glad you're sitting here with us. I mean, to you listening, we've been hold on to some of these thoughts for a while, and this just feels like the right place and the right time to just, talk.
It is a really profound shift in atmosphere, for this space, really. Because when you're inside a packed hall, shoulder to shoulder, everything is just so immediate.
Yeah, intense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But out here, sitting on the stone, looking at the shadows stretching out, it gives your mind permission to wander a bit. It gives us room to pull back and look at things from a distance. And to you sitting beside us, there's no rush today. We're just going to look at some history that, doesn't usually make it into the Friday sermons.
No, it definitely doesn't. And I was just thinking about what happened inside the mosque, 10 minutes ago. The imam was leading the prayer, and he was reciting verses from memory. Perfect, beautiful recitation.
Really beautiful, yeah.
Everyone listening, everyone moving together. And as I sat down out here, I suddenly tried to remember a conversation I had with my own brother yesterday.
Oh, wow, okay.
Just a simple, everyday conversation about what we're doing for the week. And I realized I couldn't reconstruct the actual words. I know the feeling of the conversation. I know the gist of what we agreed on. But if you put a gun to my head and told me to give you the exact word-for-word transcript, it's entirely gone.
Right. It's completely inaccessible to you. I mean, the meaning remains, but the exact phonetic sequence is just lost.
Right. And honestly, sitting here realizing how terrible my own memory is for a conversation that happened, 24 hours ago, it naturally brings up a massive question about what we just heard inside.
It does.
We're talking about a text, the Quran, that is over 77,000 words long. And the traditional narrative we're taught from childhood is that this massive, complex text was memorized perfectly, word for word, and passed down across generations through pure oral transmission.
Yeah, that's what we're told.
Nobody missed a syllable, nobody dropped a pronoun. But when you look at how human biology actually works, I just find myself wondering if that is biologically possible. Can the human brain hold 77,000 words across centuries without a single mistake?
That is, it's a question that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, honestly. But it's fundamentally the most honest place we could possibly start. Because before we open any ancient history books, before we look at medieval empires or old parchment, we're forced to look at the human mind.
Exactly, the hardware.
Right, the hardware. The believers who carry this text were human beings. And cognitive psychology has spent the last century studying how human memory actually functions. And the scientific consensus is unanimous: human memory does not work like a recording device.
But we tend to think of it like a video on our phones, don't we? You press record, you point the camera at the event, and then later you just press play.
Yeah, many people do think of it exactly that way. But the reality is far more fragile. A foundational psychologist, Frederick Bartlett, he proved decades ago that memory is reconstructive. So when you try to remember that conversation with your brother, your brain isn't pulling up a hidden audio file.
Right.
Your brain is actively rebuilding the event in real time, using whatever mental bricks and fragments it has lying around.
Oh, wow. So it's more like rebuilding a house from scratch every single time I think about it, rather than just looking at a photograph of the house.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. Every time you recall the memory, you are rebuilding the house. And because you're rebuilding it on the fly, you're highly susceptible to natural human glitches.
Like putting the wrong windows in.
Exactly. Sometimes you put a window in the wrong place. Sometimes you swap out a red brick for a brown one because they look similar.
And we aren't even aware we're doing it.
Not at all. It feels perfectly real to us. There's a famous concept in cognitive science called the law of working memory, established by George Miller. He demonstrated that the human mind can only hold about 7 distinct pieces of information, plus or minus 2 in its short-term working memory at any given time.
Wait, 7? Like how phone numbers used to be 7 digits.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
Phone numbers used to be 7 digits for a reason. To hold on to larger amounts of information, our brains are forced to chunk data into patterns.
7 chunks. And we're talking about a holy text with more than 6,000 verses. That is a staggering biological hurdle.
It really is. And beyond just the sheer volume of the text, there's the issue of temporal decay. Over time, the neural pathways weaken if they aren't constantly fired. Then you introduce something called the misinformation effect, which was heavily researched by Elizabeth Loftus.
Oh, I think I've heard of her. What did she find?
She found that the consensus of a group can actually overwrite your individual memory. Yeah, so if you witness an event, and then 3 people around you describe a specific detail slightly differently than how you remember it, your brain will often unconsciously edit your own memory to match the group. You'll actually adopt their version as your own truth.
That is terrifying if you're relying on a single person to transmit a sacred text perfectly. But wait, oral tradition isn't unique to Islam. Other ancient cultures passed down massive texts before writing was widespread, right? If we look at the Greeks or the Indians, do we see these same biological limits acting on their oral traditions?
We see the exact same biology at play, yeah. But cultures handled it differently. Take the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were entirely oral for generations before they were written down. But historians and linguists who study the structure of Homeric Greek see that the oral performance was highly fluid.
What do you mean by fluid? Weren't they reciting a specific poem?
They were, but the performers didn't memorize a fixed frozen text. They memorized the rhythm, the meter, and a massive toolbox of formulaic phrases, things like slew-footed Achilles or the wine dark sea.
Ah, so those phrases act like the chunks we were talking about earlier.
Exactly, they're cognitive chunks. When a Greek bard sat down to perform the Iliad, he was essentially improvising the story in real time within that strict rhythmic framework. The core story remained the same, but the actual wording shifted every single time he sang it.
Okay, so they embraced the reconstructive nature of memory. They didn't even try to hold on to a word-for-word standard.
Right. Contrast that with the Vedic traditions in India, which took the opposite approach. The Vedas were considered so incredibly sacred that the oral transmission had to be rigid.
So how did they get past the biology?
They used insanely complex mathematical chanting patterns. A priest would learn to recite the text forward, then backward, then skipping every other word, just to lock the phonetic sounds into a grid in their mind. It is arguably the most phenomenal feat of human memory in history.
That sounds absolutely exhausting. Did it work? Like, did they achieve perfect preservation?
It worked incredibly well. But even the Vedic tradition, with all of its mathematical safeguards, acknowledges minor variance. And crucially, they eventually had to introduce early written commentaries to support the oral tradition because human memory still faltered over thousands of years.
Right. Eventually the biology catches up. Okay, so bringing this back to the courtyard here. If human memory is reconstructive and 77,000 words is pushing the absolute boundaries of cognitive science, how did the early Muslims do it? Because the Quran doesn't use the mathematical grids of the Vedas, and it certainly isn't improvised like Homer.
Well, the early Muslim community developed something entirely different. Cognitive scientists today might describe it as a distributed cognitive network.
A distributed cognitive network, like almost like computing.
Sort of, yeah. The preservation of the text never actually relied on a single person sitting alone in a desert trying to hold 77,000 words in an isolated brain. It relied on a communal structure.
Okay, a network. So the burden isn't on the individual node, it's on the web connecting them.
Yes. Think about the mechanics of the faith itself. First, you have the ritual prayer. 5 times a day, every single day, portions of the text are recited aloud. This provides systematic daily rehearsal. In cognitive psychology, spaced repetition is the most effective way to counter the brain's natural forgetting curve. The Muslims were practicing spaced repetition before the concept even had a name.
And they still do. That's what we just did inside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it goes deeper. The community developed strict rules for tajweed.
Right, tajweed. Those are the melodic and rhythmic rules of recitation, right? The way the imam stretches certain vowels or, makes a nasal sound on certain letters.
Tajweed is a brilliant cognitive tool. It turns flat text into a multisensory experience. It engages the auditory cortex, the kinesthetic senses as your tongue moves in very specific ways, and the rhythmic centers of the brain. You aren't just remembering a dry vocabulary word, you're remembering the duration of a sound. You're remembering a melody. This creates powerful retrieval cues. If your brain momentarily drops a word, the underlying rhythm of the sentence acts as a physical cue to pull the word back into your consciousness.
I see. It's like when you hear the first three notes of a song you haven't heard in 10 years, and suddenly you can sing the entire chorus perfectly. The melody carries the data.
Exactly that. And the final piece of this network is communal auditing. When the imam leads the prayer aloud, he has a congregation standing right behind him. If his memory slips, if he swaps a word, someone in the congregation immediately speaks up to correct him. The group memory acts as a live filter for individual errors.
So when you combine daily rehearsal, musical cues, and live communal auditing, you create a high-fidelity system. You bypass the weakness of the individual human brain.
You mitigate it significantly, yes. The distributed network creates a resilience that is statistically remarkable.
I hear what you're saying. And looking at the history of the world, it is clearly an incredibly sophisticated system, but I keep coming back to a lingering doubt. Even with the prayer, even with the melody, even with the community correcting the imam, cognitive limits still exist. A community is just a collection of human brains. And if this oral memory network was truly perfect, if the traditional story of completely flawless oral transmission is entirely accurate, why did the early companions panic? Why did they feel such a desperate, undeniable need to write the text down in ink?
That is the pivotal question of the first century of Islam. And it's funny, the tradition often smooths this era over, treating the compilation of the written book as just a tidy administrative chore. When you read the early chronicles, you see that the compilation was born entirely out of crisis.
Walk me through that crisis, because we're taught that Abu Bakr and Umar just gathered the parchments as a backup.
It was much more urgent than a simple backup.
Yeah.
The first major fracture happened shortly after the Prophet passed away. The community faced internal rebellions, leading to the Battle of Yamama. It was a brutal conflict, and a significant number of the companions who had memorized large portions of the Quran were killed in combat.
Just pause and think about the physical reality of that. The text isn't sitting on a bookshelf. The text is walking around in the minds of these specific men, and suddenly, those men are dying in the dirt.
It was a terrifying realization. Umar ibn al-Khattab recognized immediately that the oral tradition was inherently vulnerable to the mortality of human beings. If the memorizers die, the text could die with them. He pressured Caliph Abu Bakr to start gathering the scattered written fragments, pieces of leather, shoulder blades of camels, palm leaves, anything that had verses physically written on it.
So the very first gathering of the text was a direct response to the fragility of human life. But that was just a private collection, wasn't it? It didn't solve the bigger problem.
No, it didn't. The real crisis, the one that forced the standardization we still live with today, happened a couple of decades later, around the year 24 or 25 of the Islamic calendar. This was during the reign of Caliph Uthman.
The empire was expanding at an unbelievable rate at this point.
It was exploding outward. You had Muslim armies pushing deep into the Persian Empire, up into the Caucasus. And this brings us to the military campaigns in Azerbaijan.
Let's really look at this moment. I want you to picture the scene with us. It's the year 24. These armies are out on the distant frontiers. It's likely freezing cold in those mountains. And you don't just have men from one city. You have soldiers conscripted from Syria, from Iraq, from the Hijaz, men from completely different tribes, different regional dialects, all thrust together into the same military camps.
And at night, or during the daily prayers, these men would stand shoulder to pray. As we discussed, prayer involves reciting the Quran aloud. But when they stood together in the cold, listening to each other recite the text, they realized they were saying different words.
Imagine the psychological shock of that. You're a soldier miles from home. You're listening to a man from a province 1,000 miles away from yours. He's reciting a verse that is the absolute core of your faith, the reason you're fighting on this frontier, and he uses a different verb or a different structure.
Right, and to a 7th century believer, that wasn't just a curiosity. It felt like a corruption of the divine word. The historical reports say the soldiers didn't just notice the differences, they turned on each other.
Wait, they were actually fighting over this?
They argued bitterly.
Yeah.
Soldiers from Damascus were telling soldiers from Kufa that their recitation was invalid. They were essentially calling each other heretics.
Over the exact wording of the text?
Yes. It escalated to the point where they were threatening violence against each other. They were on the verge of civil war and religious fracture right there on the front lines. The commander of the army, a companion named Hudhaifa ibn al-Yaman, was so alarmed by what he saw that he left the front, rode all the way back to Medina, and pleaded with Caliph Uthman to intervene.
Wow.
His famous quote to Uthman was, "O commander of the faithful, save this nation before they differ about the book as the Jews and Christians did."
And this is where I find the traditional narrative a bit difficult to swallow. We're told the oral memory was flawless and everyone agreed on the text. But if everyone agreed, why did Hudayfa have to ride back in a panic? Why did Uthman have to step in to stop a literal war over recitation differences? It implies that the oral tradition was naturally drifting.
We have to look at the history honestly, rather than through the lens of later theology. The reality is that early oral diversity existed. As the empire grew too fast, different provinces learned the text from different traveling companions. And those companions had slightly different ways of reciting. It was a natural consequence of regional isolation.
Right, it just branched naturally.
Yeah. Uthman realized that this oral diversity, even if some of it was historically authentic to those early teachers, was politically disastrous. It was tearing his fragile, expanding empire apart.
So Uthman's priority wasn't just theological purity, it was state cohesion.
Standardization was an absolute necessity for survival. You cannot have a unified empire if the people cannot even agree on the words of their holy book. So Uthman took decisive action. He commissioned a scribe named Zayd ibn Thabit, along with a small committee, to pull together a single authoritative written version of the text. They created the master template, what scholars call the razm.
The consonantal skeleton of the Arabic words.
Yes, just the basic shapes of the letters. They compiled this master copy, and then Uthman had scribes make duplicates. He sent these standard codices to the major regional centers, like Mecca, Kufa, Basra, Damascus. He established a state-sanctioned written anchor.
But he didn't just send out the new official books. He issued a very specific, very aggressive order regarding all the old books.
He ordered that all other variant codices, any personal collections of verses held by anyone else in the empire, must be burned or boiled in water to completely erase the ink.
Think about the weight of that decree. He wasn't burning the books of enemies. He was ordering the destruction of the personal notebooks of senior companions.
Yeah, highly respected people.
People like Ibn Masud, who was famously close to the Prophet. People like Ubay ibn Ka'b. These were men who had lived alongside the revelation. And the state was telling them that their personal copies were now illegal and had to be destroyed.
It was a massive flex of state power. And it wasn't accepted quietly by everyone. Ibn Masud, who was in Iraq at the time, initially refused the order. He was deeply offended.
I mean, you can understand why.
Definitely. He publicly stated that he had learned 70 chapters directly from the mouth of the Prophet himself, while Zayd ibn Thabit, the man Uthman put in charge of the committee, was just a child in comparison. Ibn Masud felt his transmission was superior, and now the state was telling him to burn his life's work for the sake of political unity.
You can completely understand his anger. But at the same time, you can understand Uthman's cold, pragmatic logic. The state needed unity. But it forces us to admit something profound. The standardization of the Quran wasn't just angels magically protecting the text from above. It was a caliph making a very hard, very human political choice to enforce uniformity with fire.
It was a highly managed historical process. Uthman recognized that pure oral transmission was naturally fracturing into regional factions, so he dropped a heavy iron anchor, the written razm, to hold the entire community in one place.
You know, sitting out here looking at the shadows, I try to imagine those fires. I try to picture someone taking a leather parchment they had cherished, dropping it into a pot of boiling water, and watching the ink lift off and dissolve. Did all these variant texts really burn? Did Uthman's order successfully destroy every trace of that early diversity? Or did the earth manage to hide some of them for us to find later?
That specific question haunted historians and scholars for over 1,000 years. The classical texts talk about these variant readings, but we had no physical proof they ever existed until 1972.
The discovery in Yemen.
Yes. In 1972, a heavy rainstorm caused part of the roof of the Great Mosque of Sana'a in Yemen to collapse. When workers went up into the ceiling structure to repair it, they found a hidden space between the inner and outer roof. And inside that space was a massive, ancient cache of manuscripts.
Tens of thousands of parchment fragments just stuffed up in the ceiling.
It was a geniza. In Islamic and Jewish traditions, if a holy text becomes worn out or damaged, you don't just throw it in the garbage. That's considered deeply disrespectful. You either bury it or you place it in a hidden architectural space to let it decay naturally. So for centuries, the people of Sana'a had been putting their damaged Qur'ans up in the ceiling.
A manuscript graveyard.
Exactly. When scholars finally got access to this graveyard, they found fragments dating back through centuries. But among the pile, they found one specific manuscript that sent shockwaves through the field of Quranic studies. It's officially cataloged as DAM 0117.1, but everyone knows it simply as the Sana palimpsest.
Palimpsest is such a beautiful word, but we should really explain the mechanics of what it is, because parchment wasn't paper. It was made of animal skin.
It was incredibly labor-intensive and expensive to produce. You had to skin the animals, stretch the hide, scrape the hair off, treat it with chemicals. If you had a large book, you were looking at an entire herd of animals.
So if you have a parchment book that you don't need anymore, or a text that has been declared outdated, say, by a caliph's decree, you don't just throw a fortune's worth of leather in the fire.
You recycle it. A scribe would take the old parchment, wash it, and physically scrape the surface to remove the top layer of ink. Then, they would write a brand new text over the clean surface. That recycled document is called a palimpsest.
It reminds me of looking at an old chalkboard in a classroom. Even after the teacher takes an eraser and firmly scrubs away the math equation to write a history timeline, if the afternoon sunlight hits the slate at just the right angle, you can still see the faint, chalky ghost of the old numbers underneath.
That is exactly what happens with parchment. The ancient ink they used was made from iron gall. Even when you scrape the surface away, the iron literally bites into the fibers of the leather. It leaves a chemical footprint. To the naked eye, the page might look clean. But centuries later, scholars can put the parchment under specialized ultraviolet light, and the ghost text the erased writing underneath glows. You can read the erased text right through the new text on top.
Man, that is amazing. And what did they see when they looked at the upper text of the Sanoa manuscript, the visible writing?
The upper text is perfectly standard. It matches the Uthmanic text that we use today. It is exactly what you would expect a scribe to write. But when scholars like Dr. Binim Sadeghi and others used UV imaging to read the erased lower text, they found something breathtaking.
The ghost text?
The ghost text dates to the mid-7th century. It is exceptionally early, and it contains significant, undeniable variants. The erased text does not match the Uthmanic standardization.
When we say variants, what kind of changes are we talking about? Are we just talking about a scribe spelling a word wrong because he was tired?
No, the differences are far deeper than simple scribal fatigue. The structure of the text itself is different. For instance, the chapters are sequenced in a completely different order than the standard book. There are variations in word order within the sentences. In Surah 36, verse 52, the words are arranged differently, which alters the syntactic flow of the verse. In Surah 2, verse 140, entire words that exist in the standard text are simply missing in the lower text. There are morphological shifts, different verb forms, different pronouns.
That is staggering. When you hear that, my immediate reaction, and probably the reaction of anyone listening right now, is to ask, does the Sana manuscript prove that the text was corrupted? Or does it just prove that Uthman's standardization was a real historical event?
Dr. Sadeghi's analysis of the variants is crucial to understanding this. He demonstrated that the variants in the erased lower text are not random, chaotic mistakes. They follow known, classical Arabic linguistic patterns. They make grammatical sense. What they represent is a genuine, independent companion text type. This means it was a valid, early stream of transmission that existed before the state stepped in.
So it isn't a corruption, it's a snapshot of the community before the anchor was dropped.
Right. It's physical, archaeological proof that the historical reports were true. Pre-Uthmanic textual diversity existed in the real world, just as the soldiers arguing in Azerbaijan suggested. And the palimpsest proves that this diversity was deliberately erased, literally washed and scraped off the page, and overwritten with the standardized Uthmanic text.
It really brings the human element of history to life. You can almost see the scene. A scribe in Yemen receives the heavy, standardized codex from Uthman's capital. He receives the order to destroy his old copies. He takes his beloved old manuscript, washes the pages, and carefully writes the new state-mandated text over the ghost of the old words.
It is a profound artifact of human obedience and political consolidation. Now, to be intellectually honest, we must balance this discovery. While the Sana palimpsest shows us the erased diversity, other early manuscript discoveries show us the incredible success of Uthman's standardization effort.
You're talking about the Birmingham manuscript?
Yes. The Birmingham fragments made headlines a few years ago because radiocarbon dating placed the parchment somewhere between 568 and 645 CE. That is astonishingly early. It places the animal's death potentially within the lifetime of the prophet, or just shortly after. And when you look at the writing on the Birmingham fragments, the consonantal skeleton aligns beautifully with the standard Uthmanic text. The same holds true for the famous Topkapi Codex in Istanbul, or the Samarkand Codex. They are later than Birmingham, but they prove a crucial point. Once Uthman established that structural skeleton, that rasm, it locked in. It remained remarkably stable across centuries.
Okay, I follow that. Uthman standardizes the skeleton. He enforces it. The skeleton remains stable. But here's where we run into a massive mechanical problem. The Arabic script back in the 7th century, it wasn't the Arabic script we see printed in books today, was it?
It was incredibly primitive compared to modern Arabic. Early Arabic script was highly ambiguous. It lacked dots to differentiate consonants, and it completely lacked vowel marks.
I really want you sitting here with us to try and visualize this for a second. Imagine trying to read English, but I take away all the vowels, and then I make 5 different consonants look exactly the same. Imagine the letter for B, the letter for T, the letter for T, the letter for N, and the letter for Y are all just drawn as a single identical little boat shape.
Right, just a curve on the page.
Exactly. The only way you would know which letter is which is if I place dots above or below the boat. 1 dot below is a B, 2 dots above is a T. But in Uthman's time, there are no dots.
None. You just have a string of identical shapes. So a single written word on the parchment could technically be read in half a dozen different ways, depending on where you mentally place the invisible dots and the invisible vowels.
So Uthman unites the empire under one written skeleton, but the skeleton itself is basically a puzzle. How did the early community actually manage this ambiguity? If the writing on the page couldn't tell you exactly how to pronounce the word, what did they do?
They had to rely on the oral tradition to decode the written text. The book was never meant to be read cold by a stranger. The parchment was just a memory aid. You needed the living teacher, someone who carried the oral tradition, to look at the dotless skeleton and tell you where the invisible dots were supposed to go.
So the written text and the oral memory had to work together.
Exactly. And this complex interplay between a fixed, state-mandated skeleton and a flexible, living oral tradition is what gave birth to the classical system of Aruf and Qur'at.
We really need to slow down and look at this, because this is the exact intersection where the popular modern narrative completely collides with classical scholarship.
It really does. The theological foundation for allowing different readings of the text is rooted in the concept of the 7 Aruf, which translates roughly to 7 modes or dialects. Traditional Islamic sources report that the prophet was granted a divine concession for the text to be recited in 7 different tribal dialects. The Arabian Peninsula was vast, and the tribes had different ways of pronouncing words, different vocabulary, different phonetic habits. To make it easier for these diverse tribes to absorb and memorize the revelation, a level of dialectal flexibility was allowed.
It was a pragmatic accommodation. So an older man from a distant tribe wouldn't struggle to twist his tongue into a foreign dialect.
Precisely. But roll the clock forward a few centuries. The empire has grown massively. Arabic grammar is beginning to be formalized. People aren't just reading from memory, they're reading from dotless texts. You couldn't just have endless, unchecked ways to decode the ambiguous skeleton. It would lead back to the chaos of Azerbaijan.
You needed authorized paths through the text.
Yes, and this need leads us to the year 936 CE, in the heart of Abbasid Baghdad. A prominent scholar named Ibn Mujahid decides to take on the monumental task of codifying the oral readings. He evaluated the various recitation traditions circulating in the major Islamic cities, Mecca, Medina, Damascus, Basra, Kufa. He looked at their chains of transmission, evaluated the reputation of the reciters, and canonized 7 specific readings, 7 Qur'at.
And he did this with the full backing of the Abbasid state, giving it the weight of law.
He did. Later scholars, recognizing other valid chains of transmission, expanded this canon. A scholar named Ibn al-Jazari famously expanded the accepted readings to 10, and eventually the tradition recognized 14 distinct authorized readings.
Yeah, I have to ask a fundamental question here, because often when people hear the term different readings, they minimize it. They assume it just means an accent, like someone from London saying water versus someone from Texas saying water. It's the same word, just a different flavor. But the Qur'at are more substantial than that, aren't they? If there is only one unchanged oral text, how can we have 14 authorized readings where words and grammar actually change? Is the modern idea of a single uniform text just an oversimplification?
It is a massive oversimplification. The differences between the Qur'at are not just regional accents. The variations affect grammar, morphology, and in many cases, the actual meaning of the verse.
Can you give us a tangible example? Show us how a word materially changes between 2 authorized readings.
The most famous, everyday example is found in the very first chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Fatiha. This is the chapter recited in every single unit of prayer by every Muslim in the world. Look at verse 4. In the reading known as Hafs, it is recited as Malik, with a long A sound. This translates to the owner of the Day of Judgment. However, in the reading known as Warsh, which is dominant in North Africa and several other authorized readings, it is recited as Malik, with short a. This translates to the King of the Day of Judgment.
King versus owner. If you look at the old dotless skeleton, MLK, both words fit the skeleton perfectly. But they are distinct words. They carry distinct theological nuances. An owner has property rights. A king has sovereign authority.
Yes, both are true, both are complementary, but the literal words coming out of the reciter's mouth are different. And this isn't an isolated case. There are thousands of these specific variations across the entire text. You find verbs changing from active tense to passive tense. You find pronouns shifting from he to we. In Surah 2, verse 259, one authorized reading says, "Look at the bones, how we assemble them." But another equally valid authorized reading says, "Look at the bones, how we resurrect them."
Again, the overarching theological meaning is preserved, but the phonetic reality, the literal data point, changes.
Exactly. And this fluidity actually caused immense tension in the early centuries, particularly with the linguists. In the 8th and 9th centuries, scholars in places like Basra and Kufa were building the formal rules of Arabic grammar. They were trying to create a mathematical science of language based on classical Bedouin poetry. But sometimes they would encounter an ancient, widely accepted Quranic reading that simply didn't fit their new, rigid grammatical rules. It sounded awkward to them.
Wait, the grammarians would actually criticize the sacred recitations.
They absolutely did. They would write treatises trying to marginalize early, authentic readings because they felt the Arabic grammar was flawed. But the masters of recitation, the men who carried the oral chains, fought back fiercely. They argued that historical oral transmission, the unbroken chain of voices going back to the prophet, trumped any theoretical rules of grammar constructed by scholars centuries later.
The human chain of transmission was the ultimate authority, not the textbook.
Yes. Now, the natural question is how classical Islamic scholars reconciled all this diversity. The great minds of the tradition, scholars like al-Baqiani or Ibn al-Jazari, didn't hide the qira'at out of embarrassment. They didn't see it as a flaw. To the classical mind, this diversity was divine richness. The razm, Uthman's written skeleton, served as the immovable anchor, and the qira'at, the 14 readings, were the authorized, divinely sanctioned paths moving within that anchor. They didn't see a contradiction between having multiple valid readings and having perfect preservation.
So, to the classical scholar, the Quran was never a single, monolithic, uniform string of sounds. It was a family of texts, a unified core that blossomed into authorized, managed variety.
That is a beautiful summary. The myth we are examining today isn't the idea that the Quran wasn't preserved. The historical preservation is extraordinary. The myth is the modern assumption of absolute, monolithic uniformity. The historical reality has always been a highly controlled family of texts.
But sitting here thinking about that, it makes you wonder about the disconnect. The classical scholars were entirely comfortable with this diversity. They celebrated it. They spent their lives writing massive, multi-volume encyclopedias documenting every single vowel difference and dot placement across the 14 readings. So why is it that if I walk outside this courtyard today and ask a random person on the street, they will likely tell me the Quran has only ever existed in one exact format? Why do most people today only know one version? If the history is so rich, why has the modern memory become so narrow? The answer to that doesn't lie in ancient history. It lies in the 20th century.
It lies entirely with the invention and application of the mass printing press.
Let's travel to early 20th century Egypt, because this is the specific moment where a 1,300-year-old, beautifully diverse oral tradition slams headfirst into the industrial age.
Before the year 1924, if you wanted to buy a printed copy of the Quran in the Middle East, it was likely imported. You were buying commercial prints coming out of Europe, from places like Leipzig, or from early presses in the Ottoman Empire. And these commercial prints were often a complete mess.
What made them a mess?
Profit-driven printing. They had typographical errors, they had inconsistent formatting, and most importantly, they didn't follow the strict classical rules of how the Arabic script should be drawn. They mixed different recitations together on the same page. It was commercial chaos.
And if you're an educator, that chaos is a nightmare. Imagine trying to teach a classroom of 50 children to memorize a text, and every child opens a book imported from a different city, and they all have slightly different spellings or dot placements for the same word.
You cannot build a national education system on a chaotic foundation. So in 1924, an esteemed committee of scholars at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, operating under the patronage of King Fuad of Egypt, decided they had to intervene. Their goal was highly pragmatic. They aimed to create a single, perfectly accurate educational standard for the state schools.
A noble goal. But the nature of creating a single standard means you are forced to make choices. You have to select one thing, which inherently means you have to exclude everything else.
Yes. The committee had 14 authorized readings to choose from. They had to pick one. They selected the reading known as Hafs and Asin, which was popular in the region. They selected the specific Kufan system for counting where the verses start and end, and then they meticulously applied the classical rules of orthography.
When you say orthography, we are talking about the absolute strictest rules of spelling and drawing the letters, right? The exact placement of every single dot, the shape of the vowels, the microscopic pause marks.
Exactly. They engineered a master template. It was a triumph of scholarship and attention to detail. But to successfully enforce this new standard, the Egyptian government had to take drastic measures. They actively suppressed and discarded the alternative commercial prints. State inspectors went into schools and mosques to remove the chaotic texts. There were historical reports of older, unapproved printing plates literally being thrown into the Nile River to prevent them from being used again.
They needed a clean slate. And I want you to think about the immense invisible power of the printing press here. A machine that was literally designed to spread knowledge broadly actually acted as a funnel. It took a wide, diverse, rich river of oral tradition, and it squeezed it under the pressure of industrial machinery into a single, frozen, visual standard.
It is a profound historical irony. Now, it is critically important to state that the scholars of the 1924 committee were not attempting a theological cover-up. They knew the history. They knew the other readings were valid. The Warsh reading, for example, remained dominant in North Africa and is still used there today.
The Al-Azhar scholars didn't declare that Hafs was the only true Quran in existence.
No, they simply decided it was the one specific version they were going to print millions of copies of for their schools.
Huh.
But the psychological side effect of that mass production was immense and unintended.
Because when Saudi Arabia later adopted this Cairo standard and they built massive printing complexes to distribute millions upon millions of free copies globally, it essentially centralized the world's visual memory.
That is exactly the mechanism. If you hand 3 generations of people the exact same printed book with the exact same dots and the exact same vowels frozen on the exact same page, eventually, human nature dictates they're going to assume the book has always looked exactly like this since the dawn of time. They forget the erased palimpsests in Yemen. They forget the 14 authorized readings. They forget the terrified soldiers arguing in the snow in Azerbaijan.
The success of the printing press was so total, so absolute, that it inadvertently created an illusion of historical uniformity.
It smoothed over 14 centuries of complex human struggle.
Let's bring this all back to you, sitting here with us in the courtyard. The shadows have stretched all the way across the stones now. The evening is starting to settle in. We have walked through a massive expanse of history together today. We started by looking at the biological, cognitive limits of human memory. We watched the panic of the early companions at Yamama. We stood with the soldiers in Azerbaijan and watched Caliph Uthman make the hard political choice to boil the ink off parchment. We illuminated the ghost text hidden under the Sana'a palimpsest. We listened to the grammarians debate the phonetic shifts of 14 different readings, and finally, we watched a printing press in 1924, Cairo, freeze the text into the specific book we recognize today. Looking at all this evidence across all these centuries, what is the final verdict? Is the preservation of this text a myth, or is it a miracle?
To frame it as a stark choice between a myth and a miracle is to rely on a false dichotomy. It forces us into a corner where we either have to deny historical evidence or deny faith. The historical reality is something far more interesting and far more complex. It is a process of managed standardization.
Managed standardization. That feels accurate.
Yes. If you look at it objectively, the preservation of the Quran is historically extraordinary. When you compare its transmission to other major texts from late antiquity, the fidelity of the core text is staggering. But it is not a scientific miracle devoid of human fingerprints. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered, grueling community effort. It required the brilliance of oral tradition, yes, but it also required written documentation, intense political choices, state standardization, and centuries of fierce scholarly canonization.
You know, I am having a quiet realization sitting here as the sun goes down. Acknowledging the human effort behind this doesn't diminish the text at all. It actually elevates the people who carried it. Recognizing the scribes who worked by candlelight to meticulously copy the dotless rasm, the scholars who fiercely debated vowel variants to protect the meaning of a single word, the caliphs who made incredibly difficult, unpopular political choices to keep the community from tearing itself apart. Acknowledging all of that makes the survival of the book profoundly real. It makes it intimately tied to human devotion.
I agree completely. True reverence for history means looking at it honestly, in all its complexity. The classical scholars of the past didn't hide this history. They didn't pretend the text magically fell out of the sky as a fully bound printed book. They documented the variants. They debated the differences. Embracing the historical reality today honors the massive generational human effort that went into preserving the meaning and the guidance of the text across 14 turbulent centuries.
It is a living legacy of human struggle, intellect, and profound devotion. And so, to you listening, sitting beside us, I want to leave you with a thought. When you open the book tonight, don't just look at the words. Look at the dots on the letters. Look at the tiny vowel marks hovering above the script. Think about the centuries of debate, the erased palimpsests and hidden ceilings, and the thousands of human voices that carried those sounds before ink ever touched the page. The book in your hands isn't just a text falling out of the sky. It is the culmination of a 1,400-year-old human struggle to hold on to something sacred.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.